Clara Whitaker woke before the rooster because the baby had found a sore place beneath her ribs and would not leave it alone. For a while she stayed on her side under the patched quilt, one hand pressed to the firm rise of her belly, listening to the small house settle in the dark. The roof gave a soft pop as the night cooled. A mouse worried at something behind the flour bin. In the hearth, one coal still held a dull red eye beneath the ash. The other half of the bed had gone cold 4 months earlier. Daniel's pillow remained where he had left it, though Clara had washed the case twice and beaten it against the porch rail until the cloth snapped in the wind. A faint smell of cedar oil still lived in it. She hated that the scent comforted her. She hated that it was fading. The baby shifted again. "I know," she whispered. "I'm getting up." Her feet found the floorboards Daniel had planed during their first winter on the ridge. He had fitted them badly in 2 places. One board near the bed complained when stepped on, and another by the stove lifted enough to catch a broom. Clara used to tease him about it. Daniel would kneel, study the gap as if it were a difficult piece of scripture, and promise to fix it after the next fence post, the next calf, the next load of timber. Now the flaws were the parts she touched most often. She lit the lamp and carried it to the washstand. The face in the small mirror looked older than 24. Her cheeks had narrowed. A pale line crossed her forehead where she had begun to frown in her sleep. She braided her brown hair, pinned it at the nape, and reached for the black dress hanging from a peg. The wool had been made for a woman who was not 6 months with child. Clara had moved the buttons twice, and still the fabric pulled. She worked the closures with stiff fingers, then wrapped a plain shawl around her shoulders to hide the strain across the bodice. On the table lay 3 coins, a grocery list, and the church notice Reverend Mercer had sent by a boy from town. Widows were expected at worship, the note said. Grief should not become an excuse for spiritual withdrawal. Clara had read it once, folded it, and set it under the salt jar. The jar was now empty. She poured the last spoonful of cornmeal into a pot and thinned it with water. While it cooked, she crossed to Daniel's workbench in the corner. Sawdust clung to the cracks despite months of sweeping. A chairback, half-shaped, rested beneath a square of canvas. Beside it was a length of desert willow Daniel had brought home in spring. He had turned the branch in his hands and said, "Bends without giving up, good wood for a cradle." At the time Clara had laughed and told him the child was no bigger than a bean. Daniel had smiled. "Then I've got time." He had not. Clara lifted the willow. It had dried to a gray-green curve. A shallow cut marked the place where his knife had begun to strip the bark. A horse snorted outside. She froze. The sound came again from beyond the yard, followed by the small clink of tack. Clara set down the branch and went to the window. Dawn had not yet reached the bottom of the canyon. The corral stood in blue shadow. Near the cottonwood at the gate, a rider sat motionless on a dark horse. She could not make out his face, but she knew the broad shoulders, the long hair tied at the back, and the rifle resting across the saddle. Mateo Chino had been Daniel's friend when no one in Bellwether would admit Daniel had one. The town called Mateo an Apache scout when they needed him to track stolen cattle, find a lost child, or carry a message through country that frightened white men. The rest of the time they called him worse things and lowered their voices only when he was near enough to hear. Clara had seen him twice since the burial. Once at the far fence line, repairing wire after a windstorm. Once on the ridge above the spring, sitting his horse against the sunset. He had not approached the house. He had not explained himself. This morning he looked toward the cabin until the first light touched the gate. Then he turned his horse and rode north without lifting a hand. Clara watched him disappear among the rocks. Her porridge burned. By the time she scraped the blackened bottom of the pot, fed the chickens, and filled a pail from the well, the eastern sky had gone white. Heat gathered early in July. It lay low over the ground, promising a hard day. The mare Daniel had left was lame in one foreleg, so Clara walked the 5 miles to Bellwether. She locked the cabin, tucked the 3 coins into her pocket, and carried an empty flour sack for the salt. The trail dropped from the ridge through mesquite and thorn, crossed a dry wash, then joined the wagon road. Lizards slipped away from her boots. Grasshoppers sprang from brittle weeds and clicked in the sunlight. At first, the walking loosened the ache in her back. After the 2nd mile, the baby seemed to settle lower. Clara shortened her steps and kept one hand beneath her belly. Daniel had walked this road beside her the year they came west. He had carried a wooden tool chest on one shoulder and talked about the ranch as though it already existed. There would be a cabin under the cottonwood, he said, a garden behind a stone wall, 2 milk cows, a cradle near the hearth. They had managed the cabin, the wall, and 1 stubborn cow before the accident at Marrow Wash. The official story was simple. Daniel had gone to inspect flood damage after a storm. His horse returned without him. Men found his body 2 days later wedged beneath a fallen cottonwood, 1 arm broken and his skull struck against stone. Arthur Bell found him. Arthur also happened to own nearly every acre between Bellwether and the southern rail spur, except the Whitaker Ridge and its spring. Clara had never accused him of anything. There was nothing she could prove. But she remembered Arthur standing at Daniel's grave, watching the ridge instead of the coffin. The church bell began ringing as Bellwether came into view. The town occupied a flat bowl of land where 2 wagon roads crossed. A row of shops faced a dusty square. The church stood at the far end with fresh white paint on its steeple and warped boards on its back wall. Arthur's Mercantile was the largest building after the church. Its upper windows had lace curtains imported from St. Louis, though the lower storeroom smelled of mice and spoiled onions. Sunday wagons rolled into town. Families arrived in pressed clothes, carrying fans, hymn books, and baskets for the meal after service. Children ran between horses until their mothers caught them by the collar. Clara stepped onto the boardwalk beside the blacksmith shop. Conversation thinned around her. A man who had borrowed Daniel's plow twice inspected a horseshoe with great interest. 2 girls who once came to Clara for sewing lessons crossed the street. Mrs. Yates, the baker's wife, lifted her hand as though she might wave, then let it fall when she saw Martha Bell watching. Martha stood outside the Mercantile in a violet dress too heavy for the weather. She was Arthur's older sister, and the closest thing Bellwether had to a queen. Her husband had died years earlier, leaving her money, a square brick house, and an appetite for managing other people's lives. 4 women clustered around her. Their parasols formed a pale circle above their hats. Clara climbed the Mercantile steps. Martha shifted to block the door. For a moment neither woman spoke. Flies moved between the hitching posts. Somewhere in the alley a bottle rolled over a plank and stopped. Martha's gaze went first to Clara's face, then deliberately to her stomach. "You have courage," she said. Clara could hear the women behind her breathing. "I need salt. I meant coming into town. The salt is still sold here, isn't it?" Martha's mouth tightened. "Some of us think a period of quiet would show respect for Daniel. I have been quiet for 4 months. Not quiet enough to stop talk." Clara felt the baby turn. She rested her palm over the movement and saw Martha notice. "What talk?" Clara asked. Martha glanced toward the street, making certain there was an audience. The sort that begins when a woman is seen receiving visits from a man her husband should never have trusted. Clara's ears rang. Mateo had never crossed her threshold. The town knew that. Truth had simply become less useful than rumor. She stepped closer until Martha had to lift her chin. "Move," a flush climbed Martha's neck. "You may not care what people believe, but Bellwether has families to protect." "From salt?" One of the women covered a smile with her hand. Martha heard it and moved aside. Inside, the Mercantile was dim and cooler by a few degrees. Coffee, leather, lamp oil, and dried apples mixed in the air. Rows of jars caught the light from the front windows. A ceiling fan hung motionless above the counter because Arthur refused to pay a boy to pull the rope on Sundays. Mr. Yates stood behind the counter, his eyes fixed on the ledger as Clara approached. "1 pound of salt," she said. He scooped it into brown paper, folded the corners, and tied the parcel with string. His fingers shook. Daniel had once spent half a day digging Mr. Yates's wagon out of Marrow Wash while a storm built over the hills. Clara put down 2 coins. "The price went up," Mr. Yates said. "Since yesterday," he swallowed. "Freight costs," she added the 3rd coin. All of Daniel's coins vanished into the till. Mr. Yates pushed the parcel toward her without looking up. Clara placed it in the flour sack. "Tell Arthur I paid what he asked." A chair scraped in the office behind the counter. Arthur Bell emerged buttoning his coat. He was a thick man in his 40s with carefully trimmed whiskers and a face that always seemed damp. A gold watch chain stretched across his vest. He smiled as if Clara had arrived for an appointment. "Mrs. Whitaker, Mr. Bell, I was sorry to miss you at the ranch last week. You didn't come to the ranch. I sent papers. You sent a boy with a blank debt notice." Arthur rested both hands on the counter. "Daniel purchased lumber through my account. Nails, seed, feed. He paid you after the spring roundup. Records disagree." "Daniel kept records too." "Did he?" Arthur's smile did not change. Then I expect you'll produce them when the county clerk asks. Clara knew the ledger Daniel had kept. It was wrapped in oilcloth beneath a loose board in the bedroom. Every purchase and payment was written in his square hand. She did not tell Arthur. "What do you want?" she asked. "Only what is owed." "The ranch?" His eyes sharpened. There it was, quick as sunlight on a blade. "A woman in your condition may find that place difficult to maintain. The spring is good. The pasture is decent. I could take the burden from you and see you settled with relatives. I have no relatives west of Missouri. Then perhaps east is where you belong." Clara lifted the salt sack. "The ridge belongs to my child." Arthur leaned closer. Coffee and clove tobacco soured his breath. "A child whose claim may not be as clean as you imagine." She held his gaze until his smile thinned. Behind her, the bell above the door jingled. Martha entered with the other women, filling the room with perfume and rustling cloth. Clara turned away from Arthur. She did not hurry. The boardwalk outside blazed under the sun, and for one dizzy second, the street tipped. She put a hand on the doorframe until the world righted itself. No one offered help. The second church bell rang. Clara could have gone home. Every sensible part of her told her to leave Bellwether, walk back to the ridge, and pray alone beside Daniel's grave. But Reverend Mercer's note lay folded beneath her salt jar. Arthur's threat still warmed her cheek like a slap. If she disappeared, the town would call it confession. She crossed the square. The church doors stood open. Reverend Amos Mercer waited on the steps in a black coat despite the heat. He was tall and narrow, with silver at his temples and a voice trained to carry over coughing, babies, and doubt. Clara had once admired him. He had married her and Daniel beneath a cottonwood when the church roof leaked. He had eaten at their table. He had held Clara's hands at the grave and spoken of mercy. Now he looked at her belly before he looked at her face. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Reverend, I'm glad you came. I received your invitation." A muscle moved in his jaw. He knew it had not been an invitation. "The congregation has been troubled," he said quietly. "There are questions. Today may offer a path toward peace." "Whose peace?" He looked past her toward Arthur and Martha approaching from the mercantile. "A community survives by shared standards. So does a gang." His eyes hardened. "Grief has made you sharp. Grief only removed my patience." Clara climbed the steps before he could answer. The church smelled of pine soap, hot wool, and candle grease. Sunlight entered through narrow windows, laying bright bars across the aisle. Families filled the front pews according to wealth. The bells occupied the second row. Martha's friends sat behind them. Ranch hands, washerwomen, and Mexican laborers took the rear benches near the door. The last pew stood empty. Clara walked to it. Every step drew a whisper from the room. She heard pieces without trying. "Too soon. Look at her. Daniel's barely gone. That's Scout." The baby kicked hard enough to make her stop. She gripped the pew end, breathed through the pressure, and sat. A wide space remained on either side of her. The organ began. The congregation rose. Clara sang none of the hymn because her throat had closed. She watched dust float in the sunbeam above the aisle and counted her breaths. Reverend Mercer opened his Bible. He began with a passage about a household divided against itself. His voice was gentle at first. He spoke of wilderness and order, of fences protecting gardens, of one diseased branch threatening a tree. Each image drew the room tighter around Clara. No one said her name. No one needed to. Mercer's eyes returned to the back pew between every verse. Clara's hands rested on her belly. Under her palms, the child was quiet now. "Compassion without correction," Mercer said, "is only cowardice wearing a soft face." Arthur murmured approval. The preacher continued. "We do no kindness when we pretend that private conduct has no public consequence. A town is a body. When one part is wounded, the wound must be cleaned, even when cleaning causes pain." Martha's fan moved slowly. Clara stared at the cross above the pulpit. Daniel had repaired it after a windstorm. She could see the darker peg he had driven through the center joint. Mercer closed the Bible. That was when Arthur stood. The floor creaked beneath him. He turned so the congregation could see his face, and Clara could see his satisfaction. "Reverend," he said, "perhaps some wounds cannot be cleaned while the source remains among us." Mercer lowered his eyes. It was permission. Arthur faced the back pew. "Daniel Whitaker was my neighbor," he said. "I respected his work, even when I questioned his judgment. He welcomed men onto his land who had no place near Christian homes. He disappeared for days with scouts and trackers. Now he lies in the ground, and his widow expects us to believe every consequence left behind is his." The room did not move. Clara heard a child ask his mother what Arthur meant. The mother hushed him. Arthur spread his hands. We must consider the reputation of Bellwether. We must consider the women and children forced to sit beside Scandal. No one sat beside Clara. She rose slowly. Her knees trembled, but her voice did not. Say what you came to say, Arthur. His eyebrows lifted. He had expected tears or silence. I'm saying the child deserves truth. The child has it. And a father? Daniel Whitaker. Arthur looked toward the windows. Others may disagree. Others weren't in my marriage. A few men shifted. Martha stopped fanning herself. Arthur's pleasant tone cracked. Your husband kept company with an Apache scout. That scout has been seen on your land since Daniel died. He has been seen near my land. An interesting distinction. Clara stepped into the aisle. You want my spring. You couldn't persuade Daniel to sell it, so now you intend him to shame his widow until she runs. Leave the baby out of your business. The accusation landed harder than she expected. Mr. Yates looked at Arthur. Two ranchers exchanged a glance. Arthur's face darkened. This is a house of worship. Then stop using it as your office. A sharp breath passed through the church. Reverend Mercer struck the pulpit with his palm. Enough, the word echoed. Clara looked at him. Yes, it is. She gathered her shawl and reached for the salt sack beneath the pew. The church doors opened behind her. No dramatic gust entered. No thunder answered. There was only the scrape of a hinge, the shift of sunlight, and the clear metal note of a spur touching the threshold. Mateo Chino stood in the doorway. Trail dust covered his boots and the lower legs of his buckskin trousers. His dark shirt was damp at the collar. A cartridge belt crossed his waist, but his hand hung empty beside it. He removed his hat, not as submission to the room, but as courtesy to Clara. Every face turned. Mateo looked past the bells, past Reverend Mercer, past the cross Daniel had mended. He walked to the last pew. His spurs sounded once, then again, each note small and exact in the quiet. Arthur's hand drifted toward his coat. Mateo stopped beside Clara and took the salt sack from her. He set it on the bench. Then he stood at her right shoulder, close enough that the warmth of him reached through her sleeve. He said nothing. Clara felt the room change, not because anyone had become kinder, but because cruelty was easier when its target stood alone. Reverend Mercer wet his lips. Mr. Chino, this service is not— Mateo looked at him. The preacher stopped. Arthur recovered first. You have no business here. Mateo's voice was quiet. She does. That is not your concern. It became mine before Daniel died. Clara turned toward him. Mateo kept his eyes on Arthur. And it remains mine. There was no threat in the sentence. That made it heavier. Arthur looked around for support. Men who had laughed moments earlier found reasons to study their boots. Mateo lifted Clara's salt sack and offered his other arm. She hesitated only once. Then she placed her hand at his elbow. They walked down the center aisle together. Martha pulled her skirts close. Mr. Yates removed his hat. A woman near the rear began to cry without sound. Reverend Mercer remained behind the pulpit with one hand resting on Daniel's repaired cross, as though he had only just noticed who had fixed it. At the door, Clara stopped and looked back. She did not speak. She let them see her face, her child, and the man who had chosen the empty place beside her. Then she stepped into the sun. Outside, the sky had changed. Clouds crowded the western mountains in dark layers, but the square still baked under hard light. Wind pushed grit along the boardwalk. The church bell rope knocked against the wall in an irregular rhythm. Clara took her hand from Mateo's arm when they reached the steps. I walked, she said. I brought the bay mare. She's lame. Not anymore. Mateo nodded toward the blacksmith shop. Daniel's old wagon waited in the alley, hitched to the mare. One wheel wore a new iron band. The split trace had been replaced with braided rawhide. You fixed it, Clara said. The horse stepped on a stone, not a broken leg. You could have told me. You were sleeping. The answer irritated her because it sounded as though he had been close enough to know. Then she remembered the rider at dawn. How long have you been watching the ranch? Mateo placed the salt beneath the wagon seat. Long enough. That is not an answer. It is the one I have. He helped her onto the seat without touching more than her forearm. His hand was rough and careful. When she settled, he tied his horse to the rear and climbed beside her. People spilled from the church but remained near the steps. Arthur appeared among them. His face had recovered its color. He spoke to Reverend Mercer with sharp movements of his hands. Martha watched the wagon. Mateo took the reins. As they rolled across the square, Clara heard Arthur call her name. She did not turn. The first mile passed in silence. Wheels crushed stones and groaned in ruts. The mare kept an even pace. Wind drove the clouds eastward and flattened the tops of the grass. Clara held her shawl closed with one hand. The other rested on the bench between them. Mateo's presence did not feel easy. It felt solid. There was a difference. Daniel had been easy company. He hummed when he worked. He filled quiet with plans, small jokes, and observations about weather. Mateo left quiet untouched. Sitting beside him was like sitting near a deep well. Clara could not see the bottom, but she knew there was something there. At Morrow Wash, the wagon slowed. The channel was dry except for a narrow thread of muddy water. Cottonwood roots gripped the banks. The tree that had trapped Daniel had been cut away, leaving a pale stump and an open patch of gravel. Clara's fingers closed around the edge of the seat. Mateo drew the mare to a stop. "Why are we stopping?" she asked. "The west clouds." She looked up. "The storm is still hours away." "Yes." He climbed down and studied the wash. He crouched beside a hoof mark pressed into damp clay, then walked upstream to the stump. Clara watched him touch a scar in the wood where an axe had bitten. "What is it?" Mateo returned to the wagon. "Daniel came here because Arthur sent word that cattle were trapped." Clara's mouth went dry. The sheriff said Daniel was checking the flood fence. Arthur told the sheriff that. "How do you know?" "I was with Daniel when the message came." The wind lifted Mateo's hair from his collar. For the first time that day, uncertainty crossed his face. Clara climbed down despite the pull in her back. "You were with him?" "Yes." "And you never told me?" "I followed a different track. 3 stolen horses north. Daniel said he would check the wash and meet me before dark. He didn't know." She walked to the pale stump. The wood had dried in long cracks. One of Daniel's shirt buttons lay in her memory beneath this tree, brown with mud, though she had never seen the place until after his body was removed. "Did Arthur lie to him?" she asked. "I found no cattle tracks in the wash, only Daniel's horse. Another rider came from town and left before the rain. Arthur? The track was from a heavy roan. Many men ride roans. Arthur rode one." Clara turned on Mateo. "You should have told me. I had tracks, not proof. You should have told me what you knew. You had buried your husband. You were sick. The child was small. That was my decision to make." Mateo accepted the words without looking away. "Yes." Anger shook her harder than grief. She struck the stump with the flat of her hand. A splinter entered her palm. "Everyone makes decisions for me," she said. "Arthur decides where I should live. Mercer decides what I should confess. Martha decides whether I may buy food. You decide which truth I can carry." Blood welled around the splinter. Mateo reached for her hand. Clara pulled it back. "Do not." He lowered his arm. The clouds dimmed the sun. A smell of rain moved across the dry channel. Mateo said, "Daniel made me promise 2 things. Clara waited. To find what happened if he did not return, and to keep you and the child on the ridge if men came for the spring." The anger inside her shifted. It did not vanish. It found a different shape. When did he ask? 2 weeks before he died. He knew Arthur was pressing him. Yes, he told me it was business. He did not want fear in the house. Clara laughed once, without humor. Another man deciding what I could carry. Mateo looked toward the ridge. Daniel was wrong to hide it. The simple agreement took some strength from her anger. "He was afraid," Mateo continued. "Not of Arthur. Of leaving you with fear every night before the child came. He thought he could settle it first. And you? I thought I could find proof before I spoke. Have you?" "Not yet." Clara examined the splinter in her palm. "Then from now on you tell me what you find when you find it. I decide what I can bear." Mateo nodded, agreed. She held out her hand. He drew the splinter with the point of his knife, wiped the blood with a clean corner of his neckcloth, and tied the cloth around her palm. His touch was brief. It was not comfort, it was respect. They crossed the wash before the rain came. At the ranch, Mateo unharnessed the mare while Clara carried the salt inside. The cabin greeted her with its familiar mixture of ash, cedar, and sun-warmed wood. She removed the black shawl and hung it behind the door. The garment looked like a piece of night trapped in the bright room. On the table, the church notice waited beneath the empty jar. Clara fed it to the stove. The paper curled. Reverend Mercer's careful writing blackened, lifted, and became ash. Outside, Mateo rolled the wagon beneath the lean-to. He checked the roof, cleared leaves from the runoff trench, and carried 2 buckets from the well. He moved as though he had been working there for years. Clara stood in the doorway. "You can come inside." He looked at the sky. "Not yet." "Because of the town? Because of you." She understood. If anyone saw him sleep beneath her roof, Arthur's lie would find new breath. "They already believe it," she said. "You do not." "No. That is enough for tonight." Mateo walked to the pile of willow near Daniel's bench and selected 2 branches. He sat on the porch step with his knife. Clara watched the bark peel in pale ribbons. Daniel wanted a cradle, she said. I know. He told you? He showed me a drawing. Of course he had. Daniel shared plans with anyone who could improve them. He once spent a supper explaining hinges to a traveling tinsmith. Mateo took a folded piece of paper from inside his shirt and handed it to her. Daniel's drawing filled the page. The lines were uneven, covered with measurements and notes. At the bottom he had written, willow sides, mesquite rockers, no nails where small hands reach. Clara pressed the paper to her lips. Mateo returned to the wood. The rain arrived at dusk, light at first. Drops darkened the porch boards and released the smell of dust. Clara cooked beans with a strip of dried beef and set a second bowl on the table. Mateo ate on the porch. She did not argue. Afterward, he built a small fire near the gate and sat with his back against the post, rifle across his knees. Clara lay awake, listening to rain touch the roof. Near midnight, hooves sounded on the road. She was out of bed before she was fully awake. The baby pressed low against her pelvis. She pulled on her boots, took Daniel's rifle from above the door, and checked the chamber. Through the window, she saw 5 riders outside the gate. Arthur's roan stood at the front. Mateo's fire had been covered. He was nowhere visible. Arthur called Mrs. Whitaker. Clara opened the door, but stayed behind the porch rail. She held the rifle down beside her leg. What do you want? Arthur removed his hat. 4 men waited behind him, Mr. Yates, 2 ranchers, and Silas Crow, the deputy clerk. Rain shone on their coats. We came as representatives of the town council, Arthur said. Bellwether has no council. It does tonight. Mr. Yates looked miserable. Arthur continued. After your behavior in church, several families are concerned. We have agreed to purchase your passage east and arrange a respectable household for you until the child is born. You agreed to spend money on a ticket? A generous solution. For whom? A horse stamped. Arthur's smile strained. You cannot remain here without support. Winter will come. The child will come. The note on this property remains unsettled. There is no shame in accepting help. You used up your concern this morning. This is not concern. It is necessity. His voice hardened. Bellwether will not have scandal planted at its edge. Clara lifted Daniel's rifle and rested it across the rail. Mr. Yates drew back. Arthur laughed, but it came too quickly. You won't shoot neighbors. You stopped being neighbors when you rode here in the rain to drive a pregnant woman from her home. Silas Crow cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitaker, Arthur has a claim recorded against the ranch. If the debt is not answered, the property may be seized. Recorded where? At the clerk's office. Show me Daniel's signature. Silas looked at Arthur. Clara saw the answer. I have Daniel's ledger. She said, every payment, every date, every witness. Arthur's horse moved sideways. Books can be altered, so can claims. The rain thickened. Water ran from the brim of Arthur's hat. You have 2 days, he said. After that, we return with lawful authority. A quiet metal click came from the dark near the corral. All 5 horses heard it. Their heads lifted. Mateo stepped into the faint light from the cabin. He wore no hat. Rain moved down his face and darkened his shirt. His rifle remained slung, but a revolver sat low at his hip. He walked to the gate and stopped behind Clara's fence. Arthur looked toward the road as though measuring the distance to town. Mateo spoke to Silas, not Arthur. You are the clerk, deputy clerk? You record what is true? Silas swallowed. What is submitted? Then you will record this. Clara Whitaker refuses the offer. No man enters this land without her permission. Arthur found some of his courage. You do not make law here. Mateo rested one hand on the gate post Daniel had set. Neither do you. This woman is alone, no. The word ended the argument. Mateo looked at the 4 men behind Arthur. Daniel pulled Yates from a flooded wagon. He repaired Crow's roof after the winter storm. He loaned seed to the Foster brothers. You remember his hands when you needed them. Remember them now. Mr. Yates lowered his head. One of the ranchers turned his horse. His brother followed. Arthur twisted in the saddle. Cords. The first rancher looked back. We came to talk, Arthur, not steal a widow's place. They rode away. Mr. Yates followed without speaking. Silas remained long enough to remove his hat toward Clara, then left. Arthur sat alone outside the gate. You think this changes anything? He asked. Clara laid the rifle against her shoulder. It changes tonight. Arthur's eyes moved between her and Mateo. Hatred gave his face a strange calm. That spring will feed the rail camp, he said. With or without you. Then he turned the roan and rode into the rain. Mateo watched until the hoofbeats disappeared. Clara lowered the rifle. Her arms began to shake. He did not take the gun from her. He waited until she leaned it against the wall herself. What did he mean about the rail camp? She asked. The survey line moved north last month. You knew? I learned yesterday. And you told me now. Yes, the small obedience mattered more than an apology. Clara sat on the porch step. Rain blew beneath the eave and cooled her face. Daniel refused to sell because the spring is the only dependable water between here and the rail line, she said. Mateo nodded. Arthur does not care about shame. He cares that shame is cheaper than purchase. Clara looked into the wet yard. Then we make it expensive. For the first time, Mateo smiled. It was slight and gone quickly, but she saw it. The next morning broke clear. The storm had left shallow pools in wagon ruts and silver drops on the thorn bushes. Heat rose from the ground before breakfast. Clara brought Daniel's ledger from beneath the bedroom floor. They spread it on the table beside Arthur's debt notice. Daniel had recorded lumber, seed, a plow blade, and 2 sacks of oats. Each entry showed payment. 3 were witnessed by Silas Crow. 1 carried Mr. Yates's initials. Mateo studied the pages. This keeps the ranch if the judge is honest. And if he isn't, we keep it another way. Clara closed the book. No killing over paper. Agreed. You agreed too quickly. I did not say no blood. She looked at him. He pointed to the yucca leaves stacked outside. They cut. Clara laughed before she could stop herself. The sound surprised them both. It was the first time she had laughed since Daniel died. They spent the morning making the cradle. Mateo showed her how to soften willow over steam and bend it around a wooden form. Clara stripped yucca fibers with the back of Daniel's draw knife. Sap stuck to her fingers, fine strands collected in her lap. He did not take work from her when she grew slow. He changed the task. When bending became too hard on her back, he set her to braiding. When the heat made her dizzy, he moved the bench into shade and brought water without comment. The cradle began as a pair of curved rails, then a narrow frame. Mateo shaped the mesquite rockers with Daniel's tools. His hands knew wood differently than Daniel's had. Daniel measured twice, frowned, and trimmed. Mateo felt along the grain, listened when the blade entered, and cut as though the branch had told him where. Clara held the drawing on her knee. He wrote no nails where small hands reach, she said. Mateo glanced at the page. He worried the child would be born grabbing tools. He hoped, he was certain. At noon they ate cold beans and cornbread beneath the porch roof. Mateo sat on the ground with his back against a post. Tell me about the promise, Clara said. He chewed, swallowed, and wiped his knife on a cloth. Daniel and I were above the North Spring. Arthur had offered him money again. Daniel said the offer would become a threat. Why didn't he go to the sheriff? The sheriff owed Arthur for his house. Mercer? Arthur paid for the new church roof. Clara looked toward Bellwether, hidden below the ridge. He bought the whole town one favor at a time. Yes. What exactly did Daniel ask of you? Mateo set down his bowl. He said, If I am gone before the child comes, keep Clara from being pushed off the land. Do not decide for her. Do not speak over her. Stand where she can see you. Clara's eyes burned. Mateo looked away, giving her privacy without leaving. He knew me better than either of us did, she said. Yes. She touched the willow frame. And the second promise? To teach the child the ridge if you wished it. Not to raise the child. Not to replace Daniel. To teach if she wished. Clara nodded. I wish it. Mateo resumed eating. The decision entered their life without ceremony. Late that afternoon, a lone rider appeared on the southern road. Mateo saw first. He stood and reached for his rifle. The rider slowed at the gate and removed a plain straw hat. Martha Bell sat on a small gray mare. She wore a faded calico dress instead of violet silk. A basket hung from her saddle horn. Mateo walked to the fence but did not open it. Martha looked smaller outside town. I came to speak with Clara, she said. Mateo waited. Clara stepped onto the porch. You were speaking. Martha dismounted, dust-coated her hem. A strand of gray hair had escaped her bun and stuck to her cheek. I brought flour, she said. Tea, bacon. Honey. I did not ask. No. Martha gripped the basket handle. You should not have needed to. The mare tugged at a weed. Clara descended one step but no farther. Martha looked at the cradle frame, at Daniel's tools, and finally at Mateo. I heard what Arthur did last night, she said. Mr. Yates told me. Did he tell you why he went? He said Arthur called it a council duty. Did you believe that? Martha's mouth trembled. Yesterday I would have. What changed? The church. Clara waited. Martha stared at the ground. When Mr. Chino stood beside you, I saw the empty space we had made. I saw it because someone filled it. Her words were plain. That made them harder to dismiss. I've spent years deciding who belongs near me, Martha continued. I told myself it was order. I told myself women like me had to protect the town. But when Arthur spoke about your child, I knew he was lying. I knew, and I sat there. Clara felt no urge to comfort her. Martha set the basket on the ground. Arthur has been using the church committee to collect statements against you. He wants Reverend Mercer to declare the household morally abandoned. Then he will argue the ranch cannot pass cleanly to the child. Can he do that? Not lawfully. But he has Silas, the sheriff, and the county clerk afraid of him. Why are you telling me? Because I found Daniel's original deed in Arthur's desk. Mateo became very still. Martha hurried on. He said he took it for safekeeping after the burial. The copy in the county book is missing the spring clause. The original gives the spring and its water rights to Daniel's heirs without condition. Clara descended the rest of the steps. Do you have it? No. Arthur locked it in the iron box. Then you brought me bread and a story. Martha flinched. I brought what I could carry without him seeing. Can you get the deed? I don't know. Find out. Martha looked up. Clara's voice stayed level. An apology feeds pride. Evidence keeps my child's home. Bring the deed or bring someone willing to swear where it is. For a moment, Martha seemed offended. Then the offense drained away. You are right, she said. Mateo opened the gate just wide enough for Martha to set the basket inside. Before she mounted, Clara said, Martha. The older woman turned. Arthur sent Daniel to Marrow Wash the day he died. There were no trapped cattle. Martha's face emptied. He would not. I do not know what he would do. That is the trouble. Martha climbed into the saddle with difficulty. She looked toward town as though it had become a place she no longer recognized. I will find the deed, she said. She rode away. Mateo carried the basket to the porch. Clara lifted the cloth. Warm bread released the smell of yeast and molasses. A jar of honey shone amber in the light. Beneath the bacon lay a bundle of clean linen folded for a baby. Clara touched it once, then covered it again. Do you trust her? Mateo asked. No, good, but I believe she was ashamed. Shame can make a person hide or move. We will see which she chooses. They returned to the cradle. As evening settled, Mateo carved small marks beneath the headrail where a child's hands would not reach. They were not letters, Clara knew. One looked like a bird track, another like water splitting around stone. What do they mean? She asked. The first says, find the high ground. The second says, bend and remain. And that one. Mateo touched a simple circle cut through by one line. A path continued after loss. Clara traced the groove with her thumb. Put Daniel's mark beside it, she said. Mateo looked toward the workbench. Daniel stamped finished furniture with a small four-pointed star. Mateo found the iron stamp, heated it in the stove, and pressed it into the underside of the cradle rail. The smell of scorched wood rose between them. The star appeared dark and clear beside the carved path. Clara closed her eyes. Outside, thunder rolled far beyond the western peaks. The storm did not arrive that night. It remained behind the mountains, flashing without sound and staining the clouds from within. Clara slept badly. She dreamed Daniel was standing in Marrow Wash with water around his knees. Each time she called to him, he bent to lift something from the current. When he straightened, he held the cradle. It was empty. Arthur stood on the bank counting coins. She woke before dawn with both hands over her belly. The child answered with a slow push beneath her palm. At the gate, Mateo's small fire had burned down to ash. He was gone. Clara dressed, fed the mare, and tried not to measure the road with her eyes. He had made no promise to announce every departure. Still, the empty place near the gate unsettled her. She found a note pinned to the post with a mesquite thorn, north fence, back by noon. The words were written in a firm hand. Clara smiled despite herself. He had listened. She spent the morning copying Daniel's ledger. If Arthur found a way into the house, he would not erase the record by taking one book. Clara wrote at the table with a bottle of ink and a sharpened quill, pausing when her fingers cramped. She copied payment dates, witnesses, quantities, and Daniel's brief comments. Paid Bell in full. Yates present. Arthur disputed feed price. Settled for agreed amount. Declined third offer for North Spring. On the final page, Daniel had written something Clara had never noticed. AB says rail survey makes water valuable. Told him value is why child must inherit it. Below that, 2 weeks later, asked MC. To stand for Clara if needed. She will dislike the asking. She will dislike being protected more. Remind him she chooses the terms. Clara stared until the ink blurred. You knew, she said to the empty room. You knew exactly how angry I'd be. The ache of missing him arrived without warning. She lowered her head to the table and let it pass through her. No great sob came. Only a quiet stream of tears. Warm on her wrists, and the faint scratch of wind against the window. When she could breathe again, she copied the page. Mateo returned at noon, carrying a length of cut wire and a horseshoe. Someone opened the north fence, he said. Cattle out too. I brought them back. Tracks, one shod horse. The right rear shoe has a split near the heel. He put the horseshoe on the table. It bore the Bell Mercantile mark, a small B struck near the toe. Arthur, Clara asked. His stable uses these, so do men who buy from him. Still not proof. No, Clara showed him Daniel's note. Mateo read it. His face gave little away, but his thumb rested on the initials MC. He was right, Clara said. About which part? All of it. Mateo set the paper down. He often was. It made him difficult. You liked him anyway. I respected him. Liking came after. What made it come? Mateo considered. He once lost $3 to me because he said a mule could not open a gate latch. Clara waited. The mule opened it. Daniel paid? He argued for an hour, then paid. That sounds like him. He spent the next week making a better latch. Clara laughed. The grief remained, but the memory no longer cut alone. It carried the sound of Daniel's voice, his stubborn hands, and a mule nosing through a gate. Mateo began fitting the cradle rockers. In the afternoon, they moved the food stores from the low shed to shelves inside the cabin. The monsoon clouds were building each day, and the wash could fill with little warning. Mateo dug a second runoff channel above the corral. Clara carried small stones in her apron and lined the trench. You should rest, he said after the fifth trip. You should remember the terms. I remember, then suggest instead of order. Mateo leaned on the shovel. I suggest you sit before you fall and make me explain to Daniel why I let his wife break her neck moving stones I could carry 4 at once. Clara lowered her apronful. That was almost polite. I am learning. She sat in the shade and sorted nails while he finished the trench. The work gave shape to the days. Morning belonged to water, animals, and repairs. The hottest hours were spent beneath the porch roof, weaving the cradle bed from yucca cord. Evenings brought wind from the mountains and the long shadows of vultures crossing the yard. Mateo never entered the bedroom. He slept near the gate when weather allowed, and in the lean-to when it did not. He ate at the table only after Clara placed a second chair across from hers and told him she would not spend winter passing bowls through a doorway. The first supper inside was awkward. He removed his hat and sat with his back to the wall. Clara served rabbit stew. The spoon looked small in his hand. Daniel's empty chair stood at the end of the table. Neither of them used it. After several minutes, Clara said, "Does silence ever tire you?" "No, it tires other people." "I know. Is that why you keep it?" "Sometimes." She waited for more and received none. "All right," she said. "Then I will talk enough for both of us." Mateo ate another spoonful. "You already do." She threw a piece of bread at him. He caught it. The next morning, Silas Crow arrived alone. He tied his horse outside the gate and waited with his hat in his hands until Clara came from the chicken yard. Mateo stood near the well, sharpening an axe. Silas looked from the blade to Clara. "I came to put something right. People have been saying that often. I suppose we've given you reason to doubt it." He removed several folded sheets from his coat. "These are copies from the county record. Your deed is entered 3 years ago, Arthur's claim from last month, and the petition Reverend Mercer signed yesterday." Clara took them. The original county entry described the ranch boundaries, but did not mention water rights. Arthur's claim listed unpaid materials totaling $87, more money than Daniel had ever owed at one time. The petition declared Clara's household unable to maintain Christian and civic order, and recommended temporary stewardship of the property. Arthur Bell was named steward. Reverend Mercer's signature ran across the bottom. Clara's stomach tightened. "Why bring this?" Silas rubbed his hat brim. "Because I signed as witness. Arthur told me it was only to protect the spring from abandonment until the baby came. Last night I remembered Daniel repairing my roof while my wife had fever. He refused payment, said neighbors didn't keep accounts for weather. You remembered late." "Yes, ma'am. Will you swear the debt claim came after Daniel died?" Silas looked toward town. If asked by a territorial judge, "I am asking," fear moved across his face. Mateo set the axe stone down. Silas glanced at him, then back at Clara. "Yes, I will swear it. Write it." Clara brought paper and ink to the porch. Silas wrote a statement with a slow, cramped hand. He dated it and signed. Mateo signed as witness. Clara folded it into the copied ledger. Before leaving, Silas said, "Arthur means to file the petition Monday. Once the county clerk accepts it, removing him will take months." "It is Friday," Clara said. "The judge is in Prescott." Yes, 3 days by road. 2 if the river crossings hold. Mateo looked at the clouds. They would not. After Silas rode away, Clara spread the documents across the table. We cannot reach Prescott before the storm, she said. Arthur cannot reach it either. He does not need to. The county clerk is here. Mateo tapped the petition. The original deed breaks this. If Martha gets it, if. Clara looked toward Bellwether. I should go to town. No. She raised an eyebrow. Mateo corrected himself. I suggest you do not walk into Arthur's store while he is preparing to steal your land. Better. He wants you angry and visible. It helps his petition. Then what do? We wait for Martha until dark. If she does not come, I go. You are known there. Yes, that was not praise. I know. Clara paced the small room, the baby pressed against her bladder. Her ankles had swollen above her boots. She was tired of her body being used as an argument against every action. I could go to Reverend Mercer, she said. He signed the petition. He also looked ashamed in the church. Shame is not courage. No. But perhaps it can be traded for it. Mateo studied her face. You want him brought here? I want him forced to choose where no pew can hide him. Before they could decide, a rifle shot cracked from the north pasture. Mateo was through the door with his weapon before the echo faded. Clara took Daniel's rifle and followed to the porch. A thin line of smoke rose near the spring. Stay here, Mateo said. I suggest you stop saying that, Clara. Something in his voice made her listen. He crossed the yard at a run and vanished behind the rise. Minutes stretched. The mare pulled against her tether. Chickens crowded beneath the wagon. Clara stood with the rifle supported on the porch rail, sight fixed on the path. A second shot came farther away, then silence. The child moved with frantic little kicks. Easy, Clara whispered, though she did not know whether she spoke to the baby or herself. Mateo appeared on the ridge leading a riderless horse. Blood marked his left sleeve. Clara set down the rifle and went to meet him. You're hurt, Crease. The bullet had torn a shallow groove along his upper arm. Blood soaked the cloth but did not pulse. The horse was a bay gelding with a Bell Mercantile shoe on the right rear hoof. The split near the heel matched the print at the fence. Whose? Clara asked. Jed Larkin's, Arthur's stableman. Where is he? Ran north. What was he doing? Mateo handed her a small canvas bundle. Inside were 3 sticks of blasting powder, fuse cord, and a tin of matches. Clara looked towards the spring. He meant to collapse it, or muddy it enough to call it failed. If the spring failed, the ranch would be worthless to me and useless to the rail camp. Not if Arthur opened it later. She pressed a cloth against Mateo's arm. Sit. It is nothing, suggesting. He sat on the porch. Clara washed the wound with boiled water and whiskey. Mateo's jaw tightened only once. His skin carried old scars, some straight, some round, one crossing the shoulder blade like a pale rope. You have been shot before, she said. Yes. How many times? I stopped counting. That is foolish. Counting does not close holes. She tied the bandage. This one will be counted. Mateo looked at her hands. 1. Good. They tethered Jed's horse in the corral and placed the blasting powder beneath a loose floorboard with the ledgers. Now they had physical evidence, but Jed himself had escaped. Near sunset, the sky lowered until it seemed to rest on the mountains. Wind moved from hot to cold in a single hour. The chickens went to roost early. Ants climbed the porch posts, carrying white eggs from the ground. Big rain, Mateo said. How big? He watched the ants, enough to change roads. Clara's lower back ached steadily. She had felt similar pain for several days and blamed the work. Mateo noticed her shift in the chair. When did it begin? This morning. How often? It is not labor. That was not my question. Clara looked away. Every hour, perhaps less. The child is early, not by much. 6 weeks 5. Mateo's expression did not soften. We need a midwife. The nearest one is Mrs. Alvarez in Bellwether. I can bring her before the wash rises. With a bullet wound? 1. Despite fear, Clara almost smiled. He saddled the bay gelding, which was fresher than his own horse. Before he mounted, she said, Do not go through town alone. I will not stop. Arthur may. Mateo checked the revolver at his hip. Then he will learn the difference. Between what? A stop and an ending. Mateo, he looked at her. No killing over paper, she said. Or pride. What about a midwife? Bring her. Do not make me raise this child while visiting you in jail. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat and rode down the ridge. The first contraction strong enough to bend Clara came before he reached the wash. She gripped the table until the wave loosened. Sweat cooled between her shoulders. When it passed, she moved deliberately through the cabin. Clean linens went near the bed. Water filled the iron pot. Martha's tea, honey, and bacon moved to the high shelf. Daniel's drawing of the cradle she tucked into the ledger bundle. She did not allow herself to consider that Mateo might not return. Rain began as scattered drops that struck the roof like thrown pebbles. In the west, lightning branched across the clouds. Another contraction came. Clara knelt beside the bed and breathed into the quilt. "Not yet," she told the child. "Give him time." The baby did not answer with movement. That frightened her more than pain. She stood and crossed to the door. The yard had gone dim. Dust moved in sheets ahead of the rain. The road was empty. A rider appeared at the gate. It was not Mateo. Martha slid from her gray mare before the animal fully stopped. She carried no basket. Her dress was torn at one sleeve, and blood marked her temple. Clara opened the door. Martha staggered inside and pulled a folded parchment from beneath her bodice. "I have it," she said. The deed bore Daniel's name, a territorial seal, and a full description of the spring rights. Clara took it with both hands. "What happened to you?" Arthur found the box open. Martha touched her temple. "He did not believe I would take it until he saw it gone. Where is he? Coming." Thunder struck close enough to shake the lamp chimney. Clara put the deed with the ledgers beneath the floor. Martha noticed the way she braced against the table. "You're in labor. It appears so. Where is Mr. Chino?" "Bringing Mrs. Alvarez." Martha went pale. "The wash is already running." The sound arrived a moment later. Hooves, several horses, fast on the wet road. Martha moved to the window. "Arthur," Clara handed her Daniel's rifle. Martha stared at it. "I have never fired one." "Then do not aim at anything you cannot bear to hit." Clara took the revolver Mateo had left beneath the flour bin and stepped onto the porch. Rain slashed the yard. Arthur rode at the gate with Jed Larkin and 2 hired men. Jed's left hand was wrapped in cloth. His bay gelding stood in Clara's corral, proof beneath the dark sky. Arthur saw Martha behind Clara and lost what remained of his composure. "You stole from me," he shouted. Martha came to the doorway with the rifle awkward against her shoulder. "I returned what you stole first." Arthur dismounted. "Give me the deed." "No," Clara said. "This is family business. You made it mine when you forged a claim against my child." Rain ran into Arthur's eyes. "You have no idea what you are holding. That spring will make Bellwether a rail stop. Shops will grow. Land will double. I have spent 10 years keeping this place alive, while fools like Daniel refused every necessary bargain. Daniel refused you. He refused the future. He refused to let you own it." Arthur stepped toward the gate. Clara raised the revolver. A contraction seized her. Her arm dropped. She caught the porch post and breathed through her teeth. Arthur saw weakness and reached for the latch. Martha fired. The bullet struck the mud near his boot. Everyone froze, including Martha. "I told you I had never fired one," she said, her voice shaking. "The next mistake may be higher." Arthur stared at his sister. "You would choose them?" Martha tightened both hands on the rifle. "I am choosing the truth. I should have done it sooner." Jed moved toward his saddle rifle. A gunshot cracked from the road behind them. The rifle flew from his hand and landed in the mud. Mateo sat on the bay gelding at the edge of the yard. Mrs. Elena Alvarez rode behind him, one arm around his waist. His wounded sleeve was dark with rain. Smoke lifted from his revolver. He dismounted and helped Elena down. Arthur backed from the gate. Mateo walked past him without speaking and entered the yard. He looked at Clara once, saw her grip on the post, and turned to Elena. "How long?" he asked. Elena was a broad, capable woman in her 50s with black hair threaded in silver. She put both hands on Clara's belly, waded through the next tightening, and nodded. "Long enough that we do not have time for foolish men." She looked at Arthur. "Go home." Arthur's hired men shifted away from him. He pointed at Mateo. "You shot at my man. I shot his rifle. You could have killed him." "Yes." The rain strengthened. Water rushed through the drainage ditch Mateo had dug. Arthur looked at the porch, the rifle in his sister's hands, the stolen horse in Clara's corral, and the scout standing inside the gate. He had come expecting a frightened widow and found witnesses. "This is not finished," he said. Clara straightened as the pain released her. "It finished when Daniel said no. You were simply too spoiled to hear it." Arthur mounted. Jed and the hired men followed him down the road. Mateo closed the gate. Elena took charge of the cabin. She ordered water boiled, linens warmed, the bed cleared, and the men out of her path. Martha moved with surprising speed. She tied back her hair, washed her hands, and cut strips from a clean sheet. Mateo carried wood inside, checked the roof braces, and secured the shutters. By nightfall, the wash had become a river. The cabin stood in a circle of rain. Water hammered the roof, poured from the eaves and ran brown across the yard. The world beyond the windows vanished. Clara's labor deepened. There was nothing noble about it. Pain came low and hard, turning her body into a thing with its own purpose. She sweated through her dress. She vomited into a basin. She cursed Daniel, the child, Arthur, the church bell, and every man who had ever told a woman to bear suffering quietly. Elena approved of the cursing. "Breath needs a road out," she said. "Words make one." Martha held a cool cloth to Clara's neck. Once their eyes met. Martha did not apologize again. She stayed. Mateo remained in the main room, visible through the open bedroom door. He fed the stove and watched the water line outside. When Clara called his name during a contraction, he came to the bedside. "I cannot," she said. He crouched so she could see him. "Yes, that is not helpful. You do not need help believing. You need the next breath." She gripped his forearm. "If I die, no. You agreed not to decide what I can carry." His jaw tightened. "If I die," she continued, "the deed goes to the child. You teach him the ridge. Martha takes the ledgers to the judge. Elena witnesses his birth. Do you understand?" Mateo held her gaze. "I understand. And you do not let Arthur name him illegitimate. No one names him but you." The next pain broke over her before she could answer. Hours lost their order. The lamp burned low. Wind drove rain through a crack near the chimney. Mateo nailed canvas across it. Martha slept for 10 minutes in a chair and woke when Clara cried out. Elena's hands remained sure. Near midnight, the roof beam above the kitchen gave a sharp crack. Mateo looked up. Water had undermined one corner of the porch. The support post leaned. "Can the house hold?" Martha asked. "For now." He took a length of timber from Daniel's workbench and braced the beam. The half-shaped chair back became a wedge. Daniel's unfinished work held the roof over his wife. Clara saw it through the doorway and began to weep. "Not from pain," she gasped. Elena understood. "Then use it anyway." A final sequence of contractions came close and fierce. Elena guided. Martha supported Clara's shoulders. Mateo stood at the bedroom door until Elena ordered him to bring more light. The child emerged into thunder. For one terrible second there was no sound. Elena rubbed the small back. "Come on, little one." Clara stopped breathing. Mateo moved closer, his face stripped of stillness. The baby coughed, then he cried. The sound was thin, angry, and alive. It cut through the storm more cleanly than any church bell. Clara reached for him. Elena wrapped the child in Martha's linen and laid him against Clara's chest. He was smaller than Clara had imagined, red-faced and furious, with damp dark hair pressed to his head. His fingers opened and closed against her skin. "Boy," Elena said. Clara looked toward Mateo. Rainwater dripped from his hair. Blood had seeped through the bandage on his arm. His eyes shone in the lamplight. But he looked away before anyone could name the emotion. "Daniel Amos Whitaker," Clara said. Reverend Mercer's first name entered the room and surprised them all. Martha stared. "After the Reverend?" "After Daniel," Clara said, "and after the man Reverend Mercer might still choose to become." Mateo understood before Martha did. The name was not forgiveness. It was a demand sent into the future. Elena tied the cord. Mateo offered his knife, bone-handled and sharpened. Clara touched the handle before Elena cut. The child cried again, outside. Something large struck the gate and tore away in the floodwater. Mateo went to the window. The north fence was gone. The corral still stood. The spring channel overflowed but held. "The ridge remains," he said. Clara closed her eyes with the child beneath her chin. "So do we." Morning came without sunrise. Gray light seeped through the wet windows. The storm had moved east, but the clouds remained low and heavy, dragging their shadows over the ridge. Clara woke to the creak of the rocking chair. Mateo sat near the hearth holding the baby. The sight stopped her. The child lay along his forearm, wrapped in white linen, one small cheek pressed against buckskin. Mateo rocked the chair with the toe of his boot. His movements were so slight that the floor barely sounded. Elena slept at the table with her head on folded arms. Martha lay beneath a blanket near the stove. The lamp had burned out. Damp wood smoked in the hearth. Mateo noticed Clara watching. "He was hungry," he said. "You cannot help with that." "No, then why do you have him?" He was loud. The baby opened his mouth in a silent yawn. "He appears content now." Mateo looked down at him. "He respects reason." Clara smiled into the pillow. Her body hurt in places she had not known could hurt. Still, beneath the exhaustion lay a strange stillness, not emptiness but completion. Daniel's absence remained. It would always remain. Yet it no longer occupied the whole room. Mateo brought the child to her. He supported the head exactly as Elena had shown him. Clara settled the boy against her and studied his face. The nose was Daniel's. The small line between the brows was also Daniel's, especially when he dreamed. "Daniel Amos," she whispered. Mateo stood beside the bed. "You dislike the second name," Clara said. "It is not mine to dislike. That means you dislike it. It is a heavy name for a small child. He can grow into it." Mateo nodded. "Then it is good." Elaine awoke and immediately began issuing orders. Clara was to remain in bed. Mateo was to boil more water. Martha was to make broth and stop apologizing every time she dropped a spoon. By mid-morning, the clouds lifted enough to reveal the damage. The porch leaned at one corner. Mud covered the yard nearly to the steps. The north fence had vanished, and a cottonwood lay across the lower road. The gate was gone. One wall of the chicken shed had collapsed, but the hens had survived beneath the wagon. The spring ran cloudy for an hour, then cleared. Bellwether could not be seen beyond the flooded wash. For 3 days, the ridge became an island. They lived by the tasks closest to hand. Mateo dug channels to drain the yard. Martha washed linens and cooked. Elena checked Clara and the child, then slept whenever there was a chair. Clara fed the baby, rested and learned the weight of his body in each position. At night, rain returned in softer showers. The cradle stood beside the bed. When Mateo finally placed Daniel Amos inside, the willow frame gave a quiet creak and accepted him. The mesquite rockers moved smoothly. Beneath the rail, Daniel's burned star sat beside Mateo's carved path. Clara touched both marks. "He has room for more," she said. "More what?" Martha asked. "More marks." His own. On the 4th day, the wash dropped enough for a horse to cross at the upper ford. Elena left first. Mateo saddled the gray mare for her and packed bread, bacon, and a jar of honey. Before mounting, Elena bent over Clara's chair and kissed the baby's forehead. "You send for me if he stops eating, turns blue, grows fevered, or if your bleeding worsens," she said. "You send for me if you are frightened even without a reason." Clara nodded. Elena looked at Mateo. "And you do not decide she is too strong to need help." Mateo accepted the correction. Martha prepared to leave with her. At the gate, or where the gate had been, she paused. "I cannot go back to Arthur's house," she said. Clara shifted Daniel Amos higher against her shoulder. "You have your own house. He will come there, then lock the door." Martha gave a tired laugh. "You make everything sound plain." "It is plain, not easy." Martha looked at the cabin, the cradle visible through the open door, and the scout rebuilding the gatepost. "I do not expect you to forgive me," she said. "Good. I would like to earn something better than what you think of me now." Clara considered. "Tell the truth in the place where you told the lie. The church? The whole town heard you without words. Let them hear you with them." Martha's face tightened with fear. Clara did not soften the demand. "All right," Martha said. She mounted behind Elena, and they picked their way toward the ford. Mateo watched until both riders reached the far bank. "Will she do it?" Clara asked. "Yes. You trust her now?" "No. But she crossed floodwater to return the deed. That counts. Actions count." It was the closest Mateo came to a creed. Reverend Mercer arrived the next afternoon. He rode a chestnut mule because the roads remained too soft for a wagon. Mud covered his boots and the lower half of his black trousers. His coat was folded behind the saddle, and his collar hung open. Without the uniform of the pulpit, he looked like an ordinary tired man. Mateo met him at the new gate. Mercer dismounted and waited. Clara sat on the porch with Daniel Amos asleep in her arms. She made no move to invite the preacher in. "I heard the child was born," Mercer said. "You heard correctly, and that the deed was found. It was stolen and returned." Mercer lowered his head. "Yes." He carried a leather tube beneath one arm. From it he removed several documents wrapped in waxed cloth. "The county clerk refused Arthur's petition this morning," he said. Silas withdrew his witness signature. Mr. Yates and the Foster brothers gave statements that Daniel paid his accounts. Martha spoke before the congregation and named her part in the rumors. Clara looked toward the road. "Did Arthur listen?" "He left before she finished, of course." Mercer held out the papers. "This is a certified copy of the original deed, including the spring clause. The territorial seal was already valid. The clerk has corrected the county record. I also signed a statement that Arthur pressured me to declare your household unfit so he could claim stewardship." Clara did not take the papers immediately. "What did he give you?" she asked. Mercer's eyes lifted. "What did Arthur give you for the petition?" "The church roof. I knew that, and money for the schoolroom. Coal last winter. He paid my lodging when the fever closed the parsonage. Then he owned your courage." Mercer flinched. Mateo stood at the gate, silent. The preacher looked at him. "When you came into the church, I believed you had brought danger into a sacred place. Mateo's expression did not change. "I see now the danger was already there," Mercer said. Clara adjusted the baby's blanket. "You saw it before Mateo entered. You simply believed it served you." "Yes." The word came quietly. Mercer climbed one porch step and stopped. "I am sorry." Clara studied the man who had married her, buried Daniel, and then offered her grief to Arthur as kindling. An apology could not restore the mourning in the church. It could not remove the moment she wondered whether her child would be safer if she disappeared. It could not make Reverend Mercer brave at the hour bravery was needed. But he had signed a statement against Arthur. He had corrected the record. He had come without a congregation to witness his humility. Clara reached for the documents. "I named him Daniel Amos," she said. Mercer's face changed. "Do not mistake that for absolution," she continued. "It is a reminder. Every time you hear his name, remember which man you were when he came into this world and which man you still have time to become." Mercer's eyes filled, but he did not look away. "I will. You will try. Yes, I will try." Daniel Amos stirred. Clara drew back the blanket enough for Mercer to see his face. "He looks like Daniel," the preacher whispered. "He is Daniel's son." Mercer nodded, ashamed of having ever required the evidence of resemblance. Clara handed the papers to Mateo. He inspected the seals, then returned them. "Arthur sent Jed Larkin to damage the spring," she said. "The powder is beneath my floor. His horse is in my corral. Mateo has the shoe that matches the track." Mercer looked toward town. "The territorial marshal is expected next week because of the rail survey. I will give him my statement." "Do that. Will you come to church when the road's clear?" "No." The answer surprised him. "Not yet," Clara added. "Perhaps not for a long time. A building does not become safe because the man at the front regrets what he allowed." Mercer accepted this. What would make it safe? Clara looked at the porch, where Martha had scrubbed blood from the boards after the birth. She looked at the gate Mateo rebuilt from flood-scored timber. She looked at Daniel's tools beneath the lean-to. "Begin by leaving the back pew open for anyone who needs it," she said. "And if one person sits there alone, go sit beside them." Mercer closed his eyes briefly. "I can do that." "Then begin there." He mounted his mule and rode away. Mateo returned to the gatepost. "You gave him a path," he said. "I gave him work." "Same thing." Clara smiled. "You are becoming talkative. I blame the house." The territorial marshal arrived 8 days later with 2 deputies and a survey engineer from the rail company. Arthur had spent the week insisting the dispute was private business. By then, Bellwether's lower storerooms were full of river mud. His flour had spoiled, his tobacco had molded, and several crates meant for the rail camp had floated into a pasture south of town. Men who once depended on his credit began questioning his books. The marshal listened to Clara on the porch. She gave him Daniel's ledger, Silas's statement, the forged debt claim, the blasting powder, Jed's horse, and the original deed. Mateo described the tracks at the spring. Martha testified that she found the deed in Arthur's iron box, and that Arthur had spoken openly about forcing Clara east. Reverend Mercer provided his signed confession. Jed Larkin lasted 20 minutes under questioning. He admitted Arthur paid him to cut the fence and set powder near the spring. He denied any role in Daniel's death. When the marshal asked about Marrow Wash, Jed looked frightened and said Arthur had ridden out that afternoon but returned before the heaviest rain. It was not proof of murder. Clara had already understood she might never receive that kind of certainty. The marshal charged Arthur with fraud, attempted destruction of property, and conspiracy to seize a lawful claim. Arthur posted bond by placing the mercantile building against it. The case would travel to the territorial court. He was ordered to remain away from the Whitaker Ridge. The rail engineer examined the spring. "We need water," he told Clara. "The company can pay for a limited easement and build the trough below your pasture. You keep ownership. No one enters the upper spring without written permission." Daniel had refused Arthur because Arthur wanted everything. The engineer offered a contract. Clara made him wait 2 days while she read every line with Silas Mercer and a lawyer the marshal recommended. Mateo sat at the table during each discussion and spoke only when asked. The final agreement paid enough to clear every remaining ranch expense, repair the flood damage, and place money in trust for Daniel Amos. It limited the rail company's water draw during drought and required it to maintain the lower road. Clara signed in her own hand. When the engineer offered his pen to Mateo as a witness, Mateo pointed to Silas. "This is her agreement," he said. "The town should learn to witness her name." Silas signed. That autumn, rails reached Bellwether. Arthur's dream came true without belonging to him. A water tower rose below the Whitaker pasture. Trains stopped twice a week. New shops opened along the South Road. Travelers came through who knew nothing of the church scandal and cared less. They bought eggs from Clara, beef from the Foster brothers, and honey from Martha. Arthur's trial was delayed through winter. By spring, he sold the mercantile to pay legal costs and left the territory before judgment. Rumor placed him in California, then Nevada. Clara never learned which was true. She did not need to. His absence did not restore Bellwether. Towns were not healed by removing one man when many people had chosen silence. Repair came slowly, through repeated small acts. Mr. Yates returned the third coin Clara had paid for salt. She refused it until he brought the full price difference charged that morning. He did. The Foster brothers rebuilt her north fence without accepting money. Clara fed them supper and made them take 2 sacks of winter apples. Silas corrected the deed book and began requiring 2 witnesses for property claims filed after a death. Martha stood before the congregation one Sunday and described what she had done. She named the rumors she spread, the doorway she blocked, and the truth she ignored. Several women stopped visiting her. Others began bringing food to the small kitchen she opened behind her house for widows, laborers' wives, and travelers without money. Reverend Mercer removed the reserved cushions from the front pews. The first Sunday after the change, he delivered no sermon. He sat in the back beside a Mexican washerwoman whose husband had been jailed after a fight. They remained there through the hymn, 2 ordinary people on a hard bench. Clara heard about it from Elena. She did not return to the church that year. Her sanctuary was the ranch. Winter sharpened the ridge. Frost silvered the trough in the mornings. Wind drove beneath the doors. Mateo built a small bunkhouse near the gate, though on the worst nights he slept beside the stove with his blanket rolled beneath his head. Daniel Amos grew from a red, furious newborn into a round-cheeked baby who watched everything. He laughed first at the sound of Mateo's spurs. He learned to sit inside the willow cradle, gripping the rails Daniel had designed. Clara added the child's mark beneath the others when he cut his first tooth, a small notch uneven and shallow. At 1 year, he pulled himself upright against Mateo's knee. At 2, he followed the scout into the yard, carrying a stick as a rifle. At 3, he asked why Mateo slept in the bunkhouse instead of the cabin. "Because that is his house," Clara said. "Are we not his family?" Mateo, repairing a bridle at the table, paused. Clara looked at him. "We are." Daniel Amos considered this. "Then he has 2 houses. Mateo resumed working. "A man should be fortunate enough to have one." "You have 2, the boy insisted. Mateo nodded. "Then I am fortunate." The arrangement remained simple because they refused to let the town define it. Mateo was not Daniel's replacement. Clara never asked him to be. He was the man who had kept a promise, and then stayed because the promise had become a life. He taught Daniel Amos to read tracts before the boy could read a newspaper. He showed him where water hid after dry months, how to approach a frightened horse, and how to listen for changes in wind along the canyon wall. Clara taught him letters, accounts, cooking, mending, and the difference between needing help and surrendering authority. When the boy asked about his father, neither adult offered a saint. Daniel had been generous, stubborn, funny, secretive, and occasionally foolish. He built poor floorboards and excellent chairs. He once lost $3 to a mule. He loved Clara enough to plan for a future he feared he might not see, but not wisely enough to tell her all his fears. The truth made Daniel larger, not smaller. Years moved through the ranch in useful sounds. Hammers, cattle bells, train whistles below the ridge, the scrape of knives over whetstones, a child's boots on the porch. The willow cradle went to the loft when Daniel Amos outgrew it. Clara wrapped it in cloth but left the carved marks uncovered. Martha visited each month. At first she brought supplies as though debt could be measured in flour. Later she came with news, sewing, and questions she once would have answered for everyone else. She and Clara never became easy friends. Something steadier formed instead. Each knew what the other had done at her worst and best. Reverend Mercer came to the ranch twice a year without asking Clara to attend church. He helped mend fence, stacked wood, and once spent an afternoon cleaning mud from the lower spring after a storm. Daniel Amos called him Reverend Amos, which made the old man wince and smile in equal measure. The case against Arthur ended with a conviction entered in his absence. His remaining property was sold. Part of the money compensated Clara for the damaged fence and spring. She used it to build a schoolroom near the rail stop on one condition: No child would be seated by race, wealth, legitimacy, or family name. Bellwether argued for 3 meetings. Clara attended all 3 with Daniel Amos beside her, and Mateo standing near the door. The school opened in spring. On the first morning, children of ranchers, railroad workers, Apache families, Mexican laborers, and shopkeepers sat at the same long tables. Their lunches smelled of corn cakes, beans, dried meat, apples, and chile. They traded food before the teacher finished taking names. Clara stood outside and listened to the noise. Daniel would have liked it. She felt Mateo beside her. "You are smiling," he said. "Do not make trouble of it. I am only witnessing, then sign your name." He drew one finger through the dust on the windowsill, leaving a straight line crossed by a small circle. The path continued after loss. Daniel Amos grew tall. At 12, he discovered the cradle in the loft. He carried it down, coughing through dust, and set it on the porch. The willow had darkened with age. The yucca webbing remained tight. Beneath the rail were the 3 marks: Daniel's star, Mateo's path, and the boy's first uneven notch. "What does mine mean?" he asked. "You were teething," Clara said. "That is not much of a legacy." It felt important at the time. Mateo took the cradle from him and examined the joints. "Your mark means you arrived and changed the house." Daniel Amos traced the star. "And my father? He built the idea." Clara said. "He touched the path. And Mateo? He made sure the idea survived." The boy looked at her. "What is your mark?" Clara had never added one. She turned the cradle over. Every curve had passed through her hands. She had stripped the fiber, held the frame, rubbed oil into the wood, rocked the child, wrapped it for storage. "I suppose the whole thing is mine," she said. Mateo's mouth lifted at one corner. "That is accurate." Daniel Amos fetched a knife. "No," Clara said. He stopped. "Not yet. Add your mark when you have done something worth remembering." "What must I do?" "That is the difficulty. No one else can choose it." At 16, he earned his first silver spurs, breaking a difficult colt for the rail superintendent. He wanted to wear them into Bellwether. Mateo shook his head. "Spurs are not bells for telling people you have arrived. You wear yours. I wear them because I forget they are there. That makes no sense." "It will." Daniel Amos left the spurs on a peg for 6 months. Then one winter night, a freight wagon overturned in Marrow Wash during sleet. He rode out with Mateo, helped free 2 trapped men, and led the horses home through darkness. The next morning he buckled on the spurs without showing anyone. Mateo noticed. He said nothing. Clara heard the metal note as her son crossed the porch and understood. By then her hair had begun to gray at the temples. The ranch had doubled its herd. The rail contract paid each year. Daniel Amos handled accounts better than Daniel ever had, and argued with Clara in almost the same tone. Mateo's scars deepened. He moved more slowly on cold mornings, but could still cross ground without sound when he wished. The 3 of them stood at Daniel Whitaker's grave each spring. Clara told her husband the news aloud. Mateo replaced stones disturbed by weather. Daniel Amos listened, then added his own report. Calves born, fences repaired, books read, mistakes made. No one spoke of what Daniel had missed as though it were a punishment. They gave him what they could. Memory kept honest, and work continued. Clara lived long enough to see Daniel Amos become master of the ridge. She did not die dramatically. There was no storm, no enemy at the gate, no church bell. One autumn afternoon, after directing the stacking of winter hay and arguing over the price of seed, she sat in Daniel's rocking chair with a cup of tea and closed her eyes. Mateo found her before sunset. Daniel Amos was repairing the lower trough. When he came up the hill, he saw Mateo on the porch with his hat in both hands. The silence told him. Bellwether filled the schoolyard for Clara's burial. Martha, bent with age, stood beside Elena Alvarez. Reverend Mercer, very old now, asked Daniel Amos where his mother should be laid. "Beside my father," he said, but facing the ridge. Mateo dug the grave. After everyone left, he remained near the gate until the stars came out. Daniel Amos sat beside him without speaking. At dawn, Mateo entered the loft and brought down the willow cradle. He set it on Clara's porch. From his belt he removed one silver spur, worn smooth along the rowel, and tied it beneath the rail beside the carved marks. Daniel Amos watched. "Is that her mark?" he asked. Mateo shook his head. "It is mine. For the trail I could not follow without her. Where will you go? North for a time. You have 2 houses." Mateo looked toward the bunkhouse in the cabin. "I did," he said. Daniel Amos stood. He was taller than the scout now, though not broader. "This one remains yours." Mateo studied the young man's face, the shape of Daniel's jaw, Clara's steady eyes, and something formed by the ridge itself. Then he nodded. He rode north that morning. He returned in spring. After that, he came and went with the seasons, never entirely leaving, never again keeping watch from obligation. The promise to Daniel had ended at Clara's grave. What remained was choice. Years later, when travelers stopped at the Whitaker Water Tower, they sometimes asked Daniel Amos about the old Apache scout who lived near the North Gate. Daniel Amos would look toward the bunkhouse, where smoke rose through the cottonwoods, and say, "He is family." If they asked for a cleaner explanation, he gave them none. The church in Bellwether still stood, its paint peeled. Its steeple leaned slightly after another monsoon. The back pew remained in place, worn smooth by generations of people who entered uncertain whether they belonged. Above it, Reverend Mercer had fixed a small wooden plaque before he died. No names were carved there, only a sentence, "Leave room beside the lonely." Daniel Amos visited once after Mercer's funeral. He sat at the far end of the bench. Sunlight lay across the floor. Dust turned in the air. He imagined his mother standing in the aisle, one hand over him before he had a name. He imagined Arthur's voice, the town's silence, and the measured sound of Mateo's spurs approaching from the open door. A young woman entered carrying a baby. Her dress was plain, and worry had hollowed her face. She paused when she saw him, uncertain. Daniel Amos moved toward the center of the pew. He left an open place beside him. The woman sat. Neither spoke through the first hymn. When the service ended, Daniel Amos walked back to the ridge. His silver spurs sounded softly on the road, not an announcement, only the natural rhythm of a man going home. At the ranch, the old willow cradle rested above the hearth. Daniel's star, Mateo's path, the childhood notch, and the weathered silver spur remained beneath the rail. Clara's mark was everywhere else. In the corrected deed locked in the desk, in the school below the hill, in the clear water moving through the trough, in the gate no mob had crossed again, and in the man her son had chosen to become. Evening settled over the Arizona high country. Cattle shifted in the pasture. A train whistled far below. Smoke from the bunkhouse and cabin rose together into the cooling air. Daniel Amos stood on the porch where his mother had once faced 5 riders, with a rifle and a child beneath her heart. He touched the gatepost Mateo had rebuilt after the flood. The wood was cracked, sun-bleached, and still standing. Then he went inside where supper waited, and the cradle kept its quiet record of all the hands that had refused to let one life be erased.